Ho, 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 'tis the season to start making some plans for your company with Darin Meyers, who runs the peer-to-peer advisory board for TAB, the alternative board. I'm Neil Gordon, and I would think the first step is, since we're here in November, you got to kind of get started, right, to plan for 2023?
Based on that, I wasn't sure if I should have brought my red Santa Claus suit, but I think the timing is important, not about planning for Christmas, but rather I like our discussion here on strategic planning. I think this is the time of the year where folks will sit down and try to put together their strategic plan going into 2023. And I thought we would talk about just maybe a few mistakes that I think are commonplace when you're putting together that plan.
So rewind the tape a year ago, and it would have been the time that CSRA companies would have been making the plan for 2022. And I'm thinking it needs to be freshened. Is that one of the mistakes?
Yeah, good lead in. Yeah. The one thing I wanted to talk about is I think sometimes people start with last year's plan and dust it off, edit it, modify it, adjust. I really think, especially this year, to your point, with what we've endured over the last year, I really think you're setting yourself up for not as well as you should if you really just dust off and start with your last year's plan. So number one is don't do that. Let's just start with a clean sheet of paper and try to have a fresh look. At the end of the day, if you have a particular item on this year's plan that's the same as last year's, probably fine. You may want to ask what could be different. Maybe is it exactly the same? But I would certainly challenge those out there doing their plans. Don't start with last year's plan as the starting point. And
I don't know if this is a mistake or not, but do you have an idea for how long a plan should be?
No, that would probably be thrown in one of my last mistakes I was going to talk about. But I certainly think that sometimes strategic plans and actions and goals can be, I think sometimes we try to take on too much. And I think it's okay to have 3 or 4 items in your strategic plan, not necessarily much more than that. I used to have an executive that used to challenge me, if you have more than 3 items on your plate, you got one too many. Now, I don't know if I don't think you can say 3's the number, but I do think the point he was trying to make is stay focused, try to prioritize a little bit, and I think that goes with your strategic plans as well, that you probably should step back and ask yourself what's really, really important and not try to dilute the thing with too many items.
Well, Coach Darin coaches local business leaders as part of the alternative board, where peers get together every month and just try to help each other grow. And I would say the commonality is we all have customers. How do customers play in to the plan, and what mistakes can people make?
Yeah, that's one of the mistakes I shared with you I was going to cover. I think, and I'm all for, working on your own internal team. That's clearly very important as well. But we don't work in a vacuum. And I think you really need to have a laser focus on your customer needs. Go back and look at what your retention has been. What are some of the feedback that you've gotten, and really try to, when you're thinking strategically, have a component in your thought of your customer standpoint. And I think all too often, and I've certainly fallen into this, is you do right by trying to focus so much on your team, but maybe you'll leave some of those other components, like customer is obviously very important for most businesses, and I think that's something that you really ought to consider when you review your entire plan. Look and say, hey, is there an aspect of this that I'm focusing on my customer angle? And if the answer is no, you really ought to rethink that and maybe say, hey, is there something I should be focusing on strategically with my customer?
Could that be committing in writing to the process of how you interact with your clients or the time you spend?
I think it probably all of the above. I think at the end of the day, what's the feedback from your customers? Does that mean you need to adapt based on that? What's your retention? You've lost some significant clients this week or this year. Why or why not? Do you need to add that to the plan? And, I want to emphasize laser focus. I think probably most people would look at it from a high-level general concept, but I think sometimes you really, in this particular area, I think you need to ask yourself, laser in on the needs of the customer and make sure that you consider that when you put it into your plan.
And we should mention that Darin's website is tabcsra.com, and clients are important and employees, the internal, but we also have to keep an eye on who's going after our market share.
Well, sure.
Who's moving our cheese?
It goes hand in hand. We sort of mentioned this in the last one, which was that I'm all for focusing on your team and making sure your team continues to improve. But like clients, your competition's a part of the playing field that you're playing on as well, and we're not operating in a vacuum. And I do think that you really your strategic planning needs to consider that competitor too. It's not just your direct competition, but is the dynamics of the society changing. For example, I've come across several people in pest control that have integrated in home inspections. It sort of logically makes sense, but you just can't necessarily look in your swim lane because things, I think, do dynamically change at a bigger macroscopic level. And I think you need to just ask yourself, how's the environment changing? And sort of have a decent understanding of what your customers are doing. Direct competitors, but also just the overall landscape. And do you need to change something? Remember, we're talking about strategic planning here. So that's probably something that business owners aren't doing on a daily basis as they're fighting fires, asking themselves, hey, what is my competition doing? What is the lay of the land economically? And so I think it's really important in your strategic plan to give yourself a moment to think about, hey, how is the landscape changing? How are my competitors doing? Some competitors even outside what I'd call your direct swim lane, but ultimately could maybe migrate into your swim lane. So I think that's exactly what you need to be doing in your strategic planning.
That's excellent. I can just think from my perspective of marketing, there are sometimes companies will go into a large campaign and spend an unusually large amount of money, and you kind of wonder what their competitors are thinking when they see all this marketing going out. And so some of it is counterpoint, isn't it?
Well, sure.
Responding.
Yeah, you don't necessarily have an inner circle connection in the competitor, but you can certainly look at some from an outside standpoint what a particular competitor's doing. And again, that I think is very important. When I say this, lacking a focus on the competition, I think you should at least focus as much on what I'm going to call that adjacent swim lane, or see that other folks that are sort of migrating into your sandbox that are surprising you. And I think that you need to look at the entire thing, not just your direct competition and their marketing flyers versus and what price increases they did, but I think also other items to consider.
Competitors calling.
Yeah, I apologize.
And they want to know if you can help them. Can you help them, Coach Darin?
I strategically didn't plan my cell phone appropriately before we started this podcast.
That's okay. He's a good guy. We've covered 3 of the 6 strategic planning mistakes that you can make going into 2023. If you will stick around, our next segment and next time we'll be sharing the podcast will be the other 3. And in the interim, please go to tabcsra.com.
Yeah, I appreciate that plug. It's we're really excited about the boards that we have, and we get a lot of good feedback that it provides a lot of value to business owners, and we're excited about it.
Yep, you can see the forest from the trees for sure. And we're very thankful to our friends here at Augusta Podcasts and Get Up Productions with the studio and the editing help and the great lighting. And we invite you to check them out and see if it's a good fit for your organization or your company.